Astrid Bennett stood framed by the Charleston sun, a worn tote bag slung over one shoulder, her shoes dusted from the long walk up the cracked driveway. The grand house looked the same, white columns, sprawling verandas, but to Astrid, it felt like a foreign country she barely remembered. She hesitated only a second before stepping inside, her heartbeat ticking loud against her ribs. "You're late." Grayson Bennett's voice cut through the stale air, sharp as the crisp lines of his tailored suit. He sat perched on the edge of a leather armchair, hands steepled under his chin, eyes cool and assessing. Donna, her stepmother, lounged nearby, tapping manicured nails against a glass of sweet tea. Astrid set her bag down quietly, swallowing the dry taste of nerves. She hadn't seen her father in years, not since he'd remarried, and decided she was too much trouble to keep around. Now he summoned her like a ghost. He wasn't quite sure he wanted to confront. "You said it was urgent," Astrid replied, keeping her voice even, polite. Her eyes flickered to the woman sitting smugly beside him. Donna's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It is," Grayson said, leaning forward. "Cameron's medical bills are piling up. She's been transferred to a private facility, one that's not exactly cheap." At the mention of her grandmother, Astrid's spine straightened. Grandma Cameron, the only soul who had loved her without condition. The one reason Astrid had worked double shifts at the diner downtown, picking up any extra hours she could. She hadn't been able to save nearly enough. Grayson folded his hands, his next words dropping like stones. "We have a solution." Astrid's stomach twisted. Solutions, in her family, were never really for her benefit. Donna set her glass down with a clink. "Mason Caldwell," she said, the name sliding off her tongue like a secret. "The Caldwell family needs a marriage alliance for appearances. Mason, however, let's just say he's not the type to make it easy." Astrid's fingers tightened against the strap of her bag. Everyone in Charleston knew the Caldwells. Old money, sprawling real estate empires, charity gala regulars. Mason was their only heir. Handsome, reckless, and unapologetically wild. "You want me to marry him?" Astrid asked, disbelief threading through her voice. Grayson shrugged, as if discussing the weather. "A simple arrangement. He needs a bride. You need the money. Cameron needs her treatment." Astrid tried to breathe, but the room felt too tight, the air too thick. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a transaction, a bargaining chip thrown on a table stained with old grudges. But Grandma Cameron's face floated behind her eyes. Her laughter, her warm hands, her endless faith in Astrid's goodness. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. She wet her lips, voice barely a whisper. "What if I say no?" Grayson's eyes hardened. "Then Cameron's care ends. Simple as that." The clock on the mantel ticked loud in the silence that followed. Astrid could hear every beat of her heart, could almost see the path splitting in front of her. One road leading back to her tiny apartment, her minimum wage life, and the slow crumbling of the only family she had left. The other, into the unknown, hand in hand with a man who wouldn't even want her. Astrid squared her shoulders, forcing the tremor from her voice. "When do I meet him?" Donna smiled, the kind of smile that made Astrid want to scrub her skin raw. "Tonight. The Caldwells are expecting you for dinner." The Caldwell estate sat on the edge of Charleston's historic district, an enormous antebellum mansion, wrapped in ivy and mystery. As the town car pulled up the curved driveway, Astrid caught her reflection in the glass. Simple dress, hair tucked back, no makeup save for a nervous flush on her cheeks. She looked like a guest at a party she hadn't been invited to. The driver opened the door. and Astrid stepped onto the gravel, heart hammering. Massive oaks lined the property, their branches dipping low like whispered warnings. She climbed the marble steps slowly, each footfall echoing louder than the last. Inside, the house was a world apart. Gleaming hardwood floors, velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers that caught the golden evening light. And standing at the foot of the grand staircase was Mason Caldwell. He was taller than she remembered from the tabloids. His suit hung carelessly off his frame, tie undone, a whiskey glass dangling loosely from his fingers. Dark hair tousled, jaw shadowed with scruff. Mason looked every bit the reckless prince she'd been warned about. And yet, there was something in the way he stood, like he carried invisible armor he didn't know how to shed. His gaze swept over her, cool and curious. Astrid fought the urge to smooth her dress under his scrutiny. "You're the sacrificial lamb?" His voice was low, smooth, faintly amused. Astrid stiffened, but held her ground. "I'm Astrid." He raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his drink before setting it down on a nearby side table with a deliberate clink. "Well, Astrid, welcome to the circus." Mason didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He just stood there studying her like a puzzle he didn't particularly want to solve. Astrid straightened her shoulders, refusing to fidget under his gaze. "If it makes you feel better," he drawled. "I'm not thrilled either." "I'm not here to make you feel anything," Astrid said quietly. The corner of Mason's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something that could have been in another life, under different circumstances. An awkward silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Somewhere deeper in the house, the muted sounds of a party filtered through the hallways. Laughter, clinking glasses, the distant notes of a piano. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. Without a word, Mason turned and began walking toward the main salon. After a beat, Astrid followed, feeling like Alice tumbling into a world built by other people's rules. Past a grand dining room and a sweeping marble staircase, they entered a smaller, more intimate room where Jacob Caldwell, Mason's father, stood waiting. A woman Astrid guessed was Caroline Foster, the childhood friend the gossip columns loved to pair Mason with. Sat poised by the fireplace, her eyes flickering over Astrid with thinly veiled disdain. Jacob extended a hand, businesslike, cool. "Astrid, welcome. We're glad you've agreed to join the family." Astrid managed a small nod, feeling Mason stiffen beside her. The night blurred after that. Introductions, dry conversation, contracts folded neatly in embossed folders, promises made with icy smiles. No one asked if she wanted to sign. It was simply expected. By the time she was allowed to escape into the gardens for air, the stars had stitched themselves across the velvet sky. Astrid gripped the iron railing overlooking the manicured lawns, breathing in deep lungfuls of night air. Behind her, footsteps approached. Mason leaned against the stone pillar beside her, arms folded. "You don't have to pretend you're okay with this," he said finally, voice lower now, almost kind. Astrid looked out into the darkness, voice steady. "I'm not pretending." A soft pause stretched between them. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain burbled, a steady heartbeat against the silence. "You don't belong here," Mason said, almost to himself. Astrid turned her head slightly. "Neither do you." For the first time that night, Mason smiled. A real one. Small, fleeting, but real. It felt strangely like the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. Not love, not friendship, just two broken pieces, laid side by side, waiting to see if they fit. The night stretched on, carrying them into a future neither could yet see, but both had already started walking toward. Together. Unwilling, unsure, but together. The next morning the sun cut sharp and bright through the lace curtains of Astrid's new room. She blinked against the light, momentarily disoriented by the high ceilings, the antique vanity across the room, the smell of old wood and something faintly floral. Gardenias, maybe. It wasn't her apartment. It wasn't home. A soft knock broke the stillness. Before Astrid could answer, Mr. Tinsley, the butler, peeked his head in, carrying a silver tray with a covered plate and a steaming cup of coffee. "Good morning, Miss Astrid," he said, offering a polite smile that somehow didn't feel condescending. "Breakfast." "Mr. Caldwell asked that you join him in the East Garden afterward." Astrid pushed herself up, brushing hair out of her face. "Thank you, Mr. Tinsley. I appreciate it." He inclined his head slightly, then disappeared with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being invisible. Astrid sat there a moment longer, staring at the tray. So this was the life she had stepped into. Polished silver, delicate china, carefully managed schedules. A life where even meals came with instructions. She ate quickly, the food tasting of nothing, nerves twisting her stomach too tightly to enjoy it. As she dressed, a simple blue sundress she'd packed hastily, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked small, out of place. Like a prop in someone else's story. The walk to the East Garden was lined with blooming azaleas and sculpted hedges. It was beautiful in the way old wealth often was, graceful, curated, and meant to impress. Mason stood by the stone fountain, tossing small pebbles into the water without much enthusiasm. His jacket was slung over one shoulder, sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from a shower. He looked infuriatingly effortless. He didn't glance at her when she approached, just flicked another pebble into the pool with a lazy flick of his wrist. "You're punctual," he said finally, voice dry. Astrid stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms loosely. "You asked me to come. I half expected you to run." He tossed another pebble, watched it ripple out across the water. "Wouldn't blame you." Astrid hesitated, the soft sounds of the garden pressing around them, the breeze in the magnolia trees, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the occasional chirp of a bird hidden among the leaves. "Why would I run?" she asked quietly. Mason finally turned to look at her, and for a moment something flickered behind his blue eyes, something raw and almost vulnerable. "Because this..." He gestured loosely at the sprawling estate, at himself, at the invisible chains binding them together. "It's not what anyone dreams about." Astrid met his gaze steadily. "Dreams don't pay hospital bills." The words slipped out harsher than she intended, and Mason flinched, barely, but she caught it. For a moment, they just stood there, strangers bound by necessity, weighed down by the quiet grief of choices neither really made. Mason shoved his hands into his pockets, breaking the tension first. "Right. Well, there's a party tonight. Caldwell Holdings' annual charity gala. Big event. Big expectations. Jacob will want to show off his newly domesticated son." Astrid raised an eyebrow. "Domesticated?" Mason smirked without humor. "Married, respectable." "Safe." He looked her up and down, not in a cruel way, but assessing, like he was trying to figure out where she fit into this jigsaw life. "You'll need a dress, something that says, 'I belong here,' even if we both know it's a lie." Astrid's mouth tightened. "And what are you planning to wear? Your usual arrogance?" Mason let out a short, surprised laugh. "You've got some teeth, Astrid Bennett." "Good. You're going to need them." Before she could respond, a voice floated toward them. Smooth. Saccharine. "Mason." "There you are." Savannah Price glided across the garden path like a queen surveying her domain. She wore a pale pink sundress that looked expensive enough to pay off half Astrid's hospital bills, her hair perfectly waved, her smile sharp. Astrid straightened instinctively, feeling like a sparrow being sized up by a hawk. Savannah's eyes flicked to Astrid, polite curiosity masking the flash of calculation. "You must be Astrid," she said, her voice sweet as spun sugar. "Mason's wife." The pause was deliberate. Tiny, but sharp enough to draw invisible blood. Astrid forced a smile. "That's right." Savannah's lips twitched. "How lovely. We were all so surprised when we heard. Mason, married." Who would have guessed? Mason shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Savannah," he said, a warning in his tone. But Savannah only laughed, a tinkling sound that felt like icicles sliding down Astrid's spine. "I'm just saying," Savannah said, turning her smile back on Astrid. "You must be very special." Astrid held her ground. "Or very desperate," she said lightly, lifting her chin. "Depends who's telling the story." For a split second, Savannah's mask slipped. Just a fraction. Astrid caught it, a flicker of something sharp and resentful beneath the polished charm. Mason looked between them, an odd expression flickering across his face, something like admiration maybe, or relief. Savannah recovered smoothly, looping her arm through Mason's. "You'll excuse us, Astrid. Mason and I have a few things to discuss before tonight." Astrid stepped back, heart pounding but face serene. "Of course." She watched them walk away, Savannah murmuring low into Mason's ear, Mason nodding stiffly. Astrid turned and headed back toward the house, every step deliberate, refusing to let them see the hollow pit growing in her chest. She had stepped into their world. She would survive it. Somehow. Back in her room, Astrid closed the door and pressed her forehead against it, exhaling slowly. The reality was sinking in deeper with every hour. This wasn't just about wearing a dress and smiling politely. It was about navigating a battlefield lined with velvet and pearls, where every glance carried meaning, every word could wound. She crossed to the bed where a garment bag had been laid out. Attached was a handwritten note, courtesy of Caroline Foster. "Welcome to the family." Astrid's fingers hovered over the zipper. She already knew. Whatever waited inside wouldn't be a gift. It would be a test. She unzipped it slowly, revealing a gown. Beautiful, yes, but also a statement. Ice blue, shimmering like frost, elegant but stiff, designed to draw attention, and whispers. Astrid's throat tightened. She could almost hear the unspoken message. Look how out of place she is. Look how she tries to fit. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. Marla Davis, her childhood friend and only lifeline in Charleston, poked her head in. "You okay?" Marla asked, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Astrid nodded, then shook her head. "No, but I will be." Marla studied her, then glanced at the gown hanging like a ghost against the wall. "You don't have to be what they want, you know. You just have to be you." Astrid's hands tightened into fists. "Sometimes that's not enough." Marla smiled gently. "It will be. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not even tomorrow. But someday." Astrid swallowed the lump rising in her throat, blinking rapidly. "Help me get ready?" she asked, voice small. Marla grinned, pulling a brush from her bag. "Always." As the sun dipped low over Charleston, casting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Astrid sat still while Marla worked, her heart steadying beat by determined beat. Tonight, she would walk into that ballroom. Tonight, she would play the part they demanded. But underneath the sequins and silk, Astrid Bennett, no, Astrid Caldwell, would still be there. Quiet. Strong. Unbreakable. And Mason Caldwell, whether he realized it or not, had just met the one storm he wouldn't be able to outrun. The Caldwell Ballroom was a masterpiece of Charleston grandeur. Crystal chandeliers dripping gold light over polished marble floors, walls draped in velvet, long tables gleaming under silver and china. Astrid stood frozen at the top of the grand staircase, clutching the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Below her, the city's elite swirled in tailored suits and glittering gowns, laughter and champagne floating up like mist. Eyes turned as she descended, the room parting around her presence, conversations faltering mid-sentence. Whispers curled through the air like smoke. Mason waited at the foot of the stairs, hands stuffed into his pockets, jaw set. His gaze found hers instantly, steady, unreadable. In the sea of strangers, he was the only anchor, and somehow that made it worse. Astrid forced her body to move, one step at a time, her ice-blue gown shimmering under the lights. She felt like a sacrificial offering being paraded for approval. When she finally reached him, Mason offered his arm stiffly, the polite move of a man playing his role. Astrid hesitated a heartbeat before taking it, feeling the heat of him even through the layers of fabric. "You clean up well," he muttered under his breath, lips barely moving. "You don't look so terrible yourself," Astrid murmured back, managing a ghost of a smile. Mason led her into the heart of the crowd. Smiles sharpened as they passed, people turning to watch them with open curiosity. Jacob Caldwell stood near the center, towering, magnetic, sipping from a glass of bourbon. His approval mattered more tonight than Astrid cared to admit. "Smile," Mason said out of the corner of his mouth. "Or at least pretend you're not plotting my murder." Astrid let out a breathy laugh despite herself, tension easing by a fraction. They made their rounds, shaking hands, exchanging shallow pleasantries. Astrid quickly learned that everyone had a motive. Some smiled too wide, others watched her too closely. They wanted to place her, dissect her, decide if she was worthy, or merely an amusing scandal. As Mason talked business with a cluster of older men, Astrid drifted toward the refreshment table, needing a moment to breathe. She was reaching for a glass of water when a familiar voice lilted over her shoulder. "Lost, sweetheart?" Astrid turned to find Savannah standing there, flawless as ever in a dark green gown that clung to her like ivy. Her smile was all sugar, but her eyes were needles. "I'm fine," Astrid said coolly, lifting her glass in a silent toast. Savannah's gaze traveled lazily over Astrid's dress, her makeup, her simple jewelry. "You know, it's brave, showing up here. Some girls might have been intimidated." Astrid sipped her water slowly, letting the silence stretch long enough to make Savannah shift. "Some girls," Astrid said, voice soft but firm, "don't scare easy." A flicker of something crossed Savannah's face. Respect, maybe, or frustration. It disappeared so quickly Astrid almost doubted she saw it. Before Savannah could reply, another woman slid into their orbit, Caroline Foster, Mason's childhood friend, looking bored and vaguely amused. "Astrid," Caroline said smoothly. "Isn't it lovely that you're adjusting so well? It must be quite a transition." Astrid met her gaze without flinching. "Everyone's adjusting tonight, Caroline. Some of us just hide it better." Caroline's smile froze for a second before she turned away with a dismissive flick of her hair. Savannah lingered a moment longer, eyes narrowing slightly. "You might have Mason's name," she said quietly, "but you'll never have his world." Astrid tilted her head, a small, knowing smile curving her lips. "We'll see." Savannah's expression tightened, but before she could say more, Mason appeared at Astrid's side, sliding a hand lightly to the small of her back. "Everything okay?" he asked, voice low but carrying an edge. Astrid smiled up at him, a real one this time. "Perfect," Savannah offered a brittle laugh. "Of course. Enjoy the evening." As she glided away, Mason leaned down slightly, his breath warm against Astrid's ear. "What did she say?" "Nothing worth remembering," Astrid said, setting her glass down. She turned toward him fully, heart pounding not from nerves now, but from something fiercer. A tiny part of her, a dangerous part, wanted to win this, whatever it was. Mason studied her face for a long beat, something unreadable flashing through his eyes. "Come with me," he said suddenly. Without waiting for agreement, he laced his fingers with hers and tugged her through the crowd, past the glittering walls and the gilded stairs, out onto a side terrace washed in moonlight. The city lights blinked below, and the cool night air rushed over Astrid's skin, raising goosebumps. Mason released her hand, pacing a few steps away before turning back. "I know what this looks like," he said, voice rougher now. "The pretty pictures, the staged smiles. The truth is, most of the people inside that ballroom would sell their soul for an ounce of power." Astrid watched him, heart hammering. "You didn't ask for this," he continued, running a hand through his hair. "Neither did I." Astrid moved closer until they stood only a breath apart. "Maybe we didn't," she said softly. "But we can still decide what we make of it." Mason's gaze dropped to her mouth, lingered there a fraction too long before dragging back up to her eyes. "You think we can fool them?" he asked, a bitter edge under the question. Astrid shook her head slowly. "No? But maybe we don't have to." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. The distant music, the soft clink of glasses, the hum of conversation all fading to a low thrum. Mason exhaled, the fight draining from his posture. He stepped closer, close enough that Astrid could feel the heat of him, the tension coiled under his skin. "You're not what I expected," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Astrid swallowed, her own pulse racing. "Neither are you." Something shifted in the air between them, fragile, electric. Mason reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a touch so careful it made her chest ache. For one suspended second, Astrid thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets with a sharp breath. "We should get back," he said, voice rough. Astrid nodded, her heart pounding in her ears. They returned to the ballroom side by side, a little closer than before, a little more aware of the invisible thread pulling tight between them. Neither spoke of what almost happened. Neither dared. But something had cracked open between them, and no matter how carefully they danced around it, neither of them would be able to pretend it wasn't there. Not for much longer. The week after the gala stretched long and slow, like the heavy humidity clinging to the Charleston air. Astrid kept her head down, finding ways to stay busy around the Caldwell estate, exploring the gardens, organizing her small corner of the vast, echoing house, anything to avoid the uncomfortable truth that lingered between her and Mason, like unspoken words. They hadn't talked about that night on the terrace. They hadn't talked about anything real since. Polite greetings at breakfast, stiff nods across the sitting room, the occasional brush of a hand too close to ignore, too fleeting to name. Astrid found herself wishing, against all logic, that he would just say something, anything to acknowledge that the ground between them had shifted. But Mason remained the perfect storm wrapped in a tailored suit, unpredictable, restless, carefully distant. On Wednesday morning, Astrid stood in the south garden, trimming back a row of wild roses that had nearly swallowed the stone walkway. The air smelled of salt and sun-warmed earth, a reminder that despite the luxury pressing in on her, life outside this estate still breathed and moved without her. She didn't hear Mason approach until his shadow fell across the path. "You're doing it wrong," he said, voice low and teasing. Astrid glanced over her shoulder, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Am I?" He crouched beside her, reaching out to lightly touch a thorny branch. "You're supposed to prune just above the node. Otherwise, it stunts the growth." Astrid arched a brow. "Didn't realize you were an expert gardener." Mason smirked, tugging off the leather gloves tucked into his belt. "Grew up helping my mother out here, before everything changed." The easy humor in his voice faltered, and Astrid caught it. The shadow that crossed his face when he spoke of his mother, the woman whose death still seemed to haunt the grand halls of this house. Astrid set the shears down carefully. "You must have been close." Mason straightened slowly, his gaze lost somewhere over the tops of the trees. "She was the only person who didn't try to turn me into something I wasn't." Astrid stood, brushing dirt from her knees. The air between them tightened, charged with a fragile honesty that felt almost too raw to touch. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Mason shook his head as if shaking off the weight. "It's life, Astrid. You learn to survive the parts that don't make sense." He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Understanding. A mirror neither had expected to find in the other. Before either of them could speak, footsteps clicked against the stone path. Astrid turned to see Caroline Foster approaching, a clipboard tucked against her side like a shield. Her smile was tight, professional. "Sorry to interrupt," Caroline said, although her tone made it clear she wasn't sorry at all. "Mason, your father asked me to confirm details for Saturday's board meeting." "He needs you." Mason's jaw tightened. "Of course he does." Caroline shifted her gaze to Astrid, her smile sharpening. "You're welcome to join, Astrid. It might be enlightening." Astrid recognized the invitation for what it was. Another test. Another chance to stumble and prove she didn't belong. Mason must have seen it too, because he hesitated, glancing at Astrid with a flicker of something almost protective. "It's not necessary," he said flatly. "Astrid's not part of Caldwell Holdings. Yet." The word hung between them, unspoken but thick with implication. Astrid lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. "It's fine. I have plenty to do." Caroline's smile widened slightly, victory gleaming in her eyes. "Of course." As Mason followed her back toward the house, Astrid remained standing among the roses, her fingers curling around the gardening shears until her knuckles turned white. She didn't need Mason's protection. She hadn't asked for it. But the casual way he had excluded her, the way Caroline had looked at her, as if she were a charity case dressed up in silk, burned deeper than she wanted to admit. She was Astrid Bennett. She had survived worse than snubs and whispers. She would survive this too. She returned to trimming the roses, every snip of the shears sharp and deliberate. That evening, Astrid wandered the halls after dinner, restless and hollow. The house was too quiet, too large. She found herself drawn back to the library, A cavernous room lined floor to ceiling with dusty books and fading portraits. She sank into a worn leather armchair by the fire, tucking her legs underneath her, and pulled a book from the stack beside her. The words blurred together, her mind replaying the day's events over and over. The look in Mason's eyes, the cold efficiency in Caroline's voice, the way Astrid had stood there and let it happen. A soft creak of the floorboards made her glance up. Mason stood in the doorway, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his tie loose, jacket abandoned somewhere along the way. He looked tired, stripped down to something real and frayed around the edges. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. "Mind if I join you?" he asked finally, his voice low, careful. Astrid closed her book slowly. "It's your house." He crossed the room and sank into the armchair opposite hers, setting his glass on the table between them. They sat in silence, the fire casting long shadows across the worn wood floor. After a while, Mason leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I shouldn't have let her talk to you like that." Astrid blinked, caught off guard by the quiet sincerity in his voice. "You didn't have to defend me," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." Astrid stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery. There was none, only exhaustion. "Regret. I'm not part of this world," she said softly. "I'm just trying to survive it." Mason's mouth curved into a rueful smile. "Welcome to the club." A beat of silence passed, heavier this time. A fragile thread stretched taut between them, trembling under the weight of everything unspoken. Mason reached out, his hand brushing the edge of her chair, not quite touching her but close enough that Astrid felt the warmth of him seep into her skin. "You don't have to survive it alone," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Astrid's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach across the chasm between them and take what he was offering, whatever fragile, broken thing it was. But survival had taught her better. Still, she didn't pull away. Slowly, carefully, she let her hand fall next to his on the worn leather armrest, their fingers almost but not quite touching. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something smaller, braver, a beginning. The fire crackled, the night deepened, and two lonely souls sat side by side learning, inch by painful inch, how to stop being strangers. The next few days unfolded in a slow, unsteady dance between Astrid and Mason. Small moments, quiet gestures. He would pour her coffee in the mornings without a word, and she would leave a book on the armrest where he liked to sit. Neither of them spoke about it, but each act stitched them closer, thread by invisible thread. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in a heavy gray mist, the kind that pressed against the windows and softened the edges of the world. Astrid stood at the tall window of the sitting room, watching the fog swirl over the Caldwell Gardens, when Mr. Tinsley appeared in the doorway. "Miss Astrid," he said with a slight bow of his head, "your grandmother, Mrs. Cameron Bennett, is here to see you." Astrid blinked, stunned for a moment, then rushed past him into the marble entryway, her sandals clicking softly against the floor. There, wrapped in a simple navy shawl, stood Grandma Cameron, frailer than Astrid remembered, but with the same determined spark in her eyes. "Grandma," Astrid whispered, voice thick, running into her arms. Cameron chuckled against her ear. "My sweet girl, look at you, standing in this fine house." Astrid pulled back, blinking away the sting in her eyes. "I didn't think you'd be strong enough to come yet." Cameron gave a dismissive wave of her hand. Doctors say a lot of things. I say when it's time to visit my granddaughter. Mason appeared on the staircase, watching them silently. For a beat, Astrid wondered if he would retreat. But then, surprising her, he descended, casual and unhurried, and came to stand beside her. "Grandma Cameron," Astrid said, her voice steadying. "This is Mason, my husband." Cameron eyed him critically, like she was inspecting a new car she wasn't sure she wanted to buy. Mason shifted awkwardly under her gaze before offering his hand. "It's good to finally meet you, ma'am." Cameron's expression softened a fraction. She took his hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "You take care of my girl, you hear?" Mason smiled. "A small, real thing." "I'm trying." Astrid's heart twisted painfully at those words, because somehow, deep down, she knew he meant them. Cameron stayed for lunch, and the atmosphere at the table felt almost normal. Astrid laughed more than she had in weeks, watching as her grandmother told Mason stories about Astrid's childhood, stories Astrid wished she could bury forever. "And she used to talk to the moon," Cameron said with a twinkle in her eye, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "Would sit on the porch steps for hours, telling it all her troubles." Mason leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Still does, I think. She just swapped the moon for staring out windows." Astrid flushed, kicking him lightly under the table, but she couldn't suppress her smile. For the first time since stepping into this life, Astrid felt something fragile but real blooming inside her. A tiny, reckless hope. After Cameron left, promising to return soon, Astrid lingered on the front steps, watching the car disappear down the long drive. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing in the cool, damp air. "You miss her already," Mason said behind her. Astrid nodded, not trusting her voice. Mason stepped closer, the heat of him a comforting shield against the mist. "She's proud of you, you know." Astrid turned her head to look at him, studying the honest lines of his face. "I don't even know who I am here." "You're you," he said simply. "That's enough." The words settled over her, warm and unexpected. Before she could reply, the low rumble of another car echoed up the drive. Mason's posture stiffened instantly. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and Jacob Caldwell stepped out, his presence sucking the air from the courtyard. Beside him, Caroline Foster followed, looking every bit the polished heir in training. Jacob's sharp gaze fell on Astrid first, assessing, cold. "We need a word, Mason," he said, without even a nod of greeting. Mason didn't move. "Whatever it is, it can wait." Jacob's mouth tightened. "It's about Astrid." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Astrid stepped back instinctively, but Mason's hand brushed her elbow, steadying her. "We can talk inside," Mason said, his voice cool steel. They moved into the study, the heavy door closing behind them with a dull thud. Astrid lingered outside, heart hammering. Inside, raised voices spilled through the thick wood. "She's not part of this," Mason was saying, sharp and clear. "She is now," Jacob snapped. "You think you can marry a nobody and the board won't question your judgment?" Astrid squeezed her eyes shut, shame burning through her chest. "She's not a nobody," Mason bit out. There was a pause. Then Jacob's voice, low and deadly. "She's a weakness, and weaknesses are exploited." Astrid backed away from the door, her stomach twisting painfully. She didn't need to hear any more. She slipped away down the hall, each step echoing hollowly. Weakness. The word clanged in her head, louder than the chime of any chandelier, sharper than any look Savannah or Caroline could have thrown her way. She ended up in the garden, standing by the fountain, where the roses still struggled to bloom under the heavy sky. She didn't know how long she stood there before Mason found her. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood silently, hands shoved into his pockets. His presence both a comfort and a question. Finally, Astrid turned to him, voice low and raw. "Is that how you see me too?" Mason's face tightened. "No." "But your father does," she said, the weight of it pressing down. "I don't care what he sees," Mason said fiercely, stepping closer. "I care what you are. And what you are is strong. Smarter than anyone in that house full of suits and lies." Astrid shook her head, tears blurring the garden into soft, aching colors. "Mason, this isn't fair to you." "You're right," he said, voice softer now. "It's not fair. None of this is. But we're in it together." Astrid stared at him, searching for cracks, for doubt, for anything that would tell her he was just playing a part. But all she saw was stubborn, reckless truth. Without thinking, she reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand. Mason caught her hand gently, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. A simple touch, but it felt like something breaking open inside her, something fierce and terrifying and achingly real. They stood like that, two broken pieces trying to fit together in a world that would rather see them apart. The fountain bubbled quietly behind them, the fog curling low around the hedges like a secret kept by the earth itself. And somewhere deep inside Astrid's chest, a new resolve bloomed. She wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The early afternoon sun slanted through the Caldwell kitchen windows, casting soft golden pools on the slate floor. Astrid stood barefoot at the counter, sleeves rolled up, a dusting of flour on her hands. She pressed the dough firmly, rhythmically, feeling the cool texture under her palms. Baking wasn't something the staff expected of her, but today she needed the grounding. Something simple, something real she could control. Behind her, the kitchen door creaked open. "You're not supposed to be working," Mason's voice rumbled lightly, carrying a faint trace of amusement. Astrid didn't turn. "I'm not working. I'm surviving." There was a pause, then the quiet scrape of a stool as Mason pulled it out and sat, resting his elbows on the butcher block island. She could feel his gaze on her, steady, unflinching, but not demanding. "You bake when you're stressed?" he asked after a moment. "I bake when I need to remember who I am," Astrid said, kneading the dough harder. Back home it was just me and Grandma Cameron. Sometimes when things got heavy, we'd bake a pie. Pretend we could sweeten life that way. Mason said nothing, but the air between them thickened with something warm and heavy. Astrid stole a glance at him. He sat there, sleeves pushed up, a faint smear of something dark, grease. Ink on his wrist. It struck her suddenly how out of place he looked in this room, this life. And yet, how right it felt, too. "You want to help?" she asked, surprising herself. Mason blinked, clearly not expecting the offer. "You trust me with that?" Astrid smiled slightly. "You can't possibly mess it up more than I already have." He stood and circled around to her side of the counter, picking up a rolling pin like it might bite him. Astrid laughed, the sound bubbling out before she could stop it. "It's a rolling pin, Mason, not a weapon." He gave her a mock-offended look. "I'm a city boy, Astrid. We order pies." "Well," she said, tossing him a ball of dough, "welcome to the country." Mason fumbled it but caught it on the second try, grinning. He rolled awkwardly, the pin clattering against the counter. Astrid laughed again, deeper this time, the tight knot in her chest loosening just a little more. Somewhere between the mess of flour and laughter, the mood shifted. Mason's hand brushed hers when reaching for more dough, lingering longer than necessary. She looked up at him, heart stuttering. He stood too close, the warm, earthy scent of him wrapping around her, chasing away the chill that seemed to live in these old walls. Their laughter faded into a silence that pulsed, alive with tension. "You've got—" Mason reached out slowly, brushing a streak of flour from her cheek with his thumb. His fingers barely grazed her skin, but it sent a shiver straight through her. Astrid swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Thanks." He didn't move away. "You're different," he said quietly, his voice rough around the edges. "You don't pretend." Astrid stared at him, every nerve in her body tuned to his presence. "Neither do you," she whispered back. For one suspended heartbeat, the world held its breath. Astrid thought, hoped, he might lean in, close the space between them. Instead, footsteps echoed sharply down the hall. Mason dropped his hand, stepping back just as Caroline appeared in the doorway, her perfect brows arched in polite surprise. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her tone the epitome of innocent inquiry. Astrid forced herself to smile. "We're just baking." Caroline's gaze flicked to the flour-dusted counter. The easy way Mason still stood near Astrid, too close to be casual. "Charming," Caroline said, her smile tightening. "Mason, your father wants to discuss tomorrow's luncheon. You'll need to review the guest list." Mason's jaw tensed. For a moment, Astrid saw the war inside him, the pull of duty, the suffocating expectations. "I'll be there," he said curtly, brushing past Caroline without another word. Caroline lingered, her eyes cool as she turned to Astrid. "You're making quite the impression." Astrid wiped her hands on a towel, refusing to let Caroline's gaze shake her. "I'm not here to impress." "No," Caroline said softly, almost pitying. "You're here because you have to be." "There's a difference." Astrid's spine stiffened. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean I'm not staying." Caroline's smile curved, razor sharp. "We'll see." She disappeared into the hall, leaving Astrid standing alone in the kitchen, heart pounding, head spinning. Later that evening, Astrid stood out on the balcony of her room, the cool night air washing over her. The city lights glimmered in the distance, 1,000 tiny promises she no longer knew if she could trust. The door behind her creaked, and she didn't have to turn to know it was Mason. He joined her silently, resting his arms on the railing, his body brushing hers just slightly, enough to feel, not enough to call attention. "You okay?" he asked after a long moment. Astrid nodded, then shook her head. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in a life I don't even recognize." Mason was quiet for a beat. Then, voice low, he said, "You're not alone." Astrid closed her eyes against the sudden rush of emotion. "It feels like it." "You're not," he repeated, firmer this time. "I see you, Astrid." She turned her head, finding his gaze steady on hers in the moonlight. "You don't have to be what they expect," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just have to be you." Astrid's throat tightened painfully. She wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt. But survival had taught her hope was dangerous. Still, standing there with Mason, with the night thick and alive around them, she thought maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. She leaned her shoulder against his, a simple, wordless act of trust. And Mason, without hesitation, leaned back, matching her weight with his own. They stood like that, anchored against the tide of a world that wanted to tear them apart, finding something solid and unbreakable in each other. For tonight, it was enough. The next morning came heavy with gray skies and the scent of coming rain. Astrid moved through the mansion with careful purpose, her mind still tangled in the quiet weight of last night, the feel of Mason's shoulder against hers, the way he had matched her hesitation with quiet certainty. Downstairs, the house buzzed with preparations. The luncheon Jacob Caldwell had insisted on was no small affair. The staff hustled, the halls smelled of fresh lilies and expensive cologne, and voices rose and fell in brisk, polished tones. Astrid paused at the base of the grand staircase, smoothing the soft green fabric of her dress. Mason was already downstairs, deep in conversation with a group of sharply dressed board members. His posture was easy but alert, a mask he wore better than he probably realized. Caroline Foster hovered nearby, clipboard in hand, radiating efficiency. When she caught sight of Astrid, her smile flickered, tight, assessing. "Astrid," Caroline said, her voice all polite sugar. "Would you mind helping with the seating cards? We had a last-minute adjustment." Astrid knew it wasn't really a request. She nodded anyway, following Caroline toward the dining hall. Inside, long tables gleamed under crystal chandeliers. White linen, polished silver, tall centerpieces dripping with orchids and ivy. It was beautiful, in a cold, curated way. A stage set for people who smiled through gritted teeth. Caroline handed Astrid a stack of place cards. "You'll be sitting at Mason's table, of course. Try not to look too uncomfortable. The board notices everything." Astrid stiffened, heat flashing under her skin. "Thank you for the advice." Caroline's lips curved, a blade hidden inside a smile. "I only want what's best for Mason." Astrid met her gaze steadily. "So do I." A beat passed, sharp and cutting. "Then we understand each other," Caroline murmured, turning away. Astrid set the cards in place with steady hands, refusing to let the words rattle her. She didn't need Caroline's approval. She didn't need anyone's. She was here for Grandma Cameron. She was here because somewhere, somehow, Mason had become something more than an obligation. The luncheon began with the usual pleasantries. Soft, clinking glasses, murmured greetings, the low hum of polite laughter. Astrid sat beside Mason, feeling the weight of 100 eyes skimming over her, judging, calculating. Mason leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Relax. You're doing better than half the people in this room." Astrid smiled, grateful for the shield of his presence even if she wouldn't admit it aloud. Halfway through the meal, Jacob Caldwell rose, commanding attention without effort. "As many of you know," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, "we are entering a new era at Caldwell Holdings. An era built not only on strong foundations, but on strong partnerships." Astrid felt Mason stiffen beside her, tension radiating off him in waves. Jacob's gaze swept the room, landing squarely on Astrid. Partnerships that must be vetted carefully, preserved wisely. The implication hung heavy, unspoken but understood. Astrid kept her face composed, her hands resting lightly on the linen-draped table, even as her stomach twisted. Savannah Price was seated 2 tables away, watching with the keen interest of someone waiting for a stumble. Beside her, Amber Bennett, Astrid's half-sister, freshly returned to Charleston, offered a thin, knowing smile. Astrid had barely spoken to Amber since arriving. Their last encounter, strained and bitter, still echoed in the back of her mind. Amber had always been good at slipping knives between ribs without ever breaking a smile. As the plates were cleared and champagne was poured, Amber approached their table with a lazy grace, a glass of sparkling wine dangling from her fingers. "Astrid," she said sweetly, leaning down so her voice carried only between them. You do clean up nice. Almost makes me forget where you came from. Mason stiffened, his hand brushing the back of Astrid's chair. Astrid smiled coolly. Funny. I don't recall asking for your opinion. Amber laughed, a soft, amused sound that made Astrid's skin crawl. Oh, sweetheart. In this world, everyone has an opinion. Better get used to it. Before Astrid could reply, Mason's hand closed lightly over hers under the table, a silent anchor. Amber straightened, her eyes gleaming with something sharp and satisfied, and drifted away into the crowd. Astrid exhaled slowly, turning her hand over to lace her fingers with Mason's. Thank you, she murmured. You don't need me to fight your battles, Mason said quietly. But I'm here anyway. Astrid tightened her grip for a moment, letting the simple truth of his words settle into her bones. The luncheon dragged on, the conversations turning from business to politics to art. Astrid answered questions when addressed, kept her head high, and endured the lingering glances. When the final toast was made, and the guests began to trickle out into the sprawling gardens for after-lunch drinks, Astrid slipped away, needing air. She found herself at the edge of the reflecting pool, watching the water ripple under the lazy breeze. Mason followed, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel. You were incredible in there, he said, stopping beside her. Astrid shook her head, a wry smile pulling at her lips. I was trying not to drown. Same thing. They stood in silence, watching the sky darken with the promise of an evening storm. Amber's going to be a problem, Astrid said finally. Mason's jaw tightened. She already is. And your father? Mason exhaled, long and slow. He's not going to make this easy. Astrid turned to him, feeling the weight of everything pressing in. Then we'll make it harder for them. Mason smiled, a real, slow smile that made her heart kick hard against her ribs. Together? He asked. Astrid reached out, her fingers brushing his lightly. Together. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, cool and heavy, dotting the surface of the pool. Neither of them moved. Let it rain, Astrid thought. Let it pour. She wasn't running. Not anymore. The rain poured heavier by the time Astrid and Mason made it back into the house, their clothes damp, hair clinging to their faces. They burst through the side door laughing, breathless from their sprint across the courtyard. Mason shook the water from his hair, droplets scattering across the tile floor, and Astrid laughed harder, covering her mouth with her hand. It wasn't polished or poised. It was real, chaotic, full of life, the kind of moment Astrid hadn't dared to imagine when she first walked into this world. You look like a drowned cat, Mason teased, grinning. And you look like you lost a wrestling match with a hurricane, Astrid shot back, wringing out the ends of her hair. He stepped closer, close enough that the heat of him cut through the chill clinging to her skin. His eyes softened, the teasing fading into something quieter, heavier. You're beautiful. You know that, he said, voice rougher now. Astrid froze, the words hitting harder than she expected. She searched his face, waiting for the usual smirk, the playful edge. But there was none. Just sincerity, raw and disarming. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Astrid stepped back instinctively as Caroline rounded the corner, umbrella in hand, perfectly dry and composed despite the storm. Her eyes flickered over them, Astrid's dripping dress, Mason's untucked shirt, and something sharp flickered across her face before smoothing into polite neutrality. There you are, Caroline said brightly. Jacob wants to meet. Upstairs library. It's urgent. Mason's jaw tightened. Now? Caroline's smile didn't reach her eyes. Now. Mason looked at Astrid for a beat longer, something unspoken passing between them, then turned away without a word, following Caroline up the sweeping staircase. Astrid stood there a moment, water dripping onto the marble, feeling the warmth Mason had left behind slowly fading from the air. She turned and headed upstairs to change, the laughter from moments ago still echoing faintly in her chest, even as a knot of unease settled deeper. 2 hours later, the storm outside had dulled into a steady patter, but the atmosphere inside the house buzzed with a tension Astrid couldn't shake. She wandered through the halls, restless, until she found herself outside the library. The door was slightly ajar, voices drifting through, Jacob's low and commanding, Mason's tight and strained. "You think the board is going to tolerate this distraction much longer?" Jacob was saying. "You're risking everything." "I'm not risking anything that matters," Mason snapped back. Astrid pressed her hand to the doorframe, her stomach twisting. "You underestimate appearances," Jacob continued. "The girl, she's a liability, Mason. Every minute she stays here, she weakens you." Astrid flinched as if slapped. "You don't know her," Mason said, voice low but fierce. "And you sure as hell don't know me." Silence followed, thick and ugly. Astrid backed away before she heard more, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. Downstairs the foyer buzzed with new energy. More guests arriving. Apparently tonight was impromptu drinks and socializing, another calculated move by Jacob to parade Mason's loyalty to the company. Astrid descended the staircase slowly, feeling every eye that turned toward her. She caught sight of Savannah Price near the grand piano, glass of champagne in hand, her laughter ringing too loud, too practiced. Amber stood with a cluster of younger executives, her gaze sliding over Astrid like she was part of the wallpaper. Astrid crossed the room toward the terrace doors, needing air, needing space. She hadn't even reached the threshold when a familiar voice drawled behind her. "Running away again?" She turned to find Savannah standing there, looking impeccable in a deep red gown, her smile razor-sharp. "Just getting some air," Astrid said calmly. Savannah sipped her drink, studying her over the rim. "You know," she said, lowering the glass, "it's fascinating. Watching you try so hard to fit in, like dressing up a stray cat and expecting it to behave at a dinner party." Astrid's hands curled at her sides, nails biting into her palms. "You're right," Astrid said coolly. "I don't belong here. Not by your standards." Savannah arched a brow, clearly intrigued. "But I'm not going anywhere," Astrid continued, her voice steady. "You don't get to decide who belongs." Savannah's smile faded, just slightly. Before she could reply, Mason appeared, stepping between them with a casualness that was anything but accidental. "Problem here?" he asked, his voice mild but carrying an unmistakable warning. Savannah laughed lightly. "Not at all. Just girl talk." She brushed past them, her perfume lingering in the air like a fading threat. Astrid stared at the closed terrace doors for a long moment, feeling Mason's gaze burning into her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I wanted to," Mason said, just as quietly. Astrid turned to face him, the low lighting softening the hard lines of his face, making him seem almost unbearably vulnerable. "They're never going to accept me," she said, the words ripping out before she could stop them. Mason stepped closer, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they won't." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, barely a touch, but enough to send a jolt of electricity through her veins. "But I do," he said, voice low, fierce. "I choose you, Astrid, no matter what they think." Astrid blinked, her throat tight, her heart hammering. Mason smiled. A little broken, a little brave. The rest of them can go to hell. Astrid laughed through the tears rising in her eyes. The sound choked and real. She didn't know if she could survive this world. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to survive it alone. Mason laced their fingers together tightly, grounding her. And for the first time since stepping into the Caldwell house, Astrid realized she wasn't just fighting for a place. She was fighting for something far more dangerous. Something far more precious. A future she never thought she could have. A future worth everything. The storm had finally passed, leaving the air thick and clean. The sky stretched wide and bruised with the last traces of twilight. Astrid stood on the back terrace with Mason, their hands still loosely linked, the rest of the house fading into the background like a bad dream slipping away. But peace in this house never lasted long. The sharp click of heels on stone broke the quiet. Astrid turned to see Amber striding toward them, her expression carefully composed, her smile a little too tight. "There you are," Amber said, as if they'd been hiding from her. Family meeting, inside. Mason didn't move. His hand tightened slightly around Astrid's. "We're fine out here," he said flatly. Amber's smile sharpened. "It's about Astrid." Astrid felt the shift immediately. Mason's body tensed beside her. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. Reluctantly, they followed Amber back into the house. The library's heavy doors were already open, light spilling into the hallway, voices murmuring inside. When they entered, Jacob Caldwell was seated behind the massive oak desk, fingers steepled in front of him. Caroline stood by the window, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Astrid's stomach twisted as she realized this had been orchestrated. She was walking into an ambush. Jacob didn't waste time. "We've received information," he said coolly, "that Astrid's financial situation before marrying into this family was desperate." Astrid froze. Mason's hand brushed her lower back, a silent reassurance. Jacob continued, each word precise. "There are debts, unpaid medical bills, past due rent." "Employment instability?" Astrid swallowed hard, shame prickling at her skin. "So what?" Mason said, his voice calm but lethal. "We all knew she didn't come from a trust fund." Jacob's gaze shifted to him, sharp and heavy. "Appearances, Mason, perception. If the board believes you married a woman with financial motivations—" "She married me to save her grandmother's life," Mason snapped. "You think that makes her weak? Makes her greedy?" Silence pulsed through the room. Jacob leaned back in his chair. "It makes her a vulnerability." Caroline stepped forward smoothly. "There are options. Quiet annulments. Financial settlements? No public mess?" Astrid flinched, as if the words themselves struck her. Mason turned to look at her then. Really look. His expression was unreadable, but his hand found hers again, curling around it tightly. "What do you want, Astrid?" Mason asked, voice low enough that only she could hear. Astrid blinked up at him, heart hammering. "You could walk away," a voice whispered inside her. "You could leave before they tear you apart." But when she opened her mouth, the words that came were steady. "I want to stay." Mason smiled then, a slow, fierce thing that made her chest ache. He turned back to Jacob and Caroline. "Then that's the end of it," Mason said. "We're not going anywhere." Jacob's mouth tightened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Mason said, "but it's my mistake to make." Without another word, he led Astrid out of the library, the doors swinging closed behind them with a soft but decisive thud. They didn't speak as they moved through the empty halls, past oil paintings and marble statues. the old bones of the Caldwell legacy, watching them with silent judgment. Only when they reached the garden did Mason finally stop, pulling Astrid into the shelter of a massive oak tree. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," he said, voice rough. Astrid covered his hands with her own, grounding herself against him. "Neither do you." For a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, the storm-washed earth beneath their feet, the heavy scent of wet leaves filling the air. Mason leaned in, forehead resting against hers, breath mingling in the humid air. "We'll make our own family," he whispered. "Our own rules." Astrid closed her eyes, letting the promise settle deep into the hollow places inside her. Because maybe blood built houses like the Caldwell mansion, but love, messy, stubborn, reckless love, built homes, and she wasn't about to lose hers. Not now, not ever. A soft rumble of distant thunder rolled across the sky, but neither of them moved. They stood there, a defiant, fragile fortress against the world, and for the first time, Astrid truly believed they might just survive it. Together. The air in the Caldwell mansion carried a strange, electric hum after the confrontation in the library. Astrid could feel it vibrating through the walls, hanging heavy in the long corridors, trailing them like a shadow wherever she and Mason went. It wasn't over. Not even close. She sat curled up in one of the smaller sitting rooms later that evening, tucked against the corner of a worn leather couch, a blanket thrown over her legs. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting soft gold light across the room, but it did little to chase away the chill settling deep inside her bones. Footsteps approached, and a moment later Mason dropped onto the couch beside her, close enough that his knee brushed hers. He didn't speak right away, just stared into the fire, jaw tense. Astrid watched him quietly. "You're thinking too loud." A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just wondering how much longer I can hold the walls back." She shifted, turning to face him more fully. "You're not alone in this." He leaned his head back against the couch, closing his eyes briefly. "Sometimes it feels like it." Astrid reached out, threading her fingers through his. "I'm here, Mason." "I'm not running." He opened his eyes then, and for the first time in a long while, she saw something raw and unguarded staring back at her. "I know," he said hoarsely, "and that's the scariest part." Before she could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Mr. Tinsley stood at the doorway, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Pardon me, Mr. Caldwell. Mrs. Bennet is here to see you both." Astrid blinked. "Grandma Cameron?" Mr. Tinsley inclined his head. "She's waiting in the sunroom." Astrid threw off the blanket, her heart already racing. She hadn't expected her grandmother tonight, and certainly not after the storm of the afternoon. Mason stood too, his hand lingering at the small of her back as they made their way through the quiet halls. The sunroom was dimly lit, the windows thrown open to let in the cool night air. Grandma Cameron sat in a wicker chair near the windows, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a small smile playing at her lips. "Grandma," Astrid breathed, crossing the room quickly. Cameron rose slowly, embracing her with surprising strength. "You look tired, sweetheart," Cameron said softly, pulling back to study her face. "But stronger, too." Astrid smiled, a lump forming in her throat. "It's been a long few days." Cameron's eyes shifted to Mason, who stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets, watching them with a guarded expression. "Thank you for standing by her," Cameron said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Mason shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat. It's not hard. She's worth it. Astrid blinked rapidly, the weight of those words settling heavy and sweet in her chest. Cameron reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped package. She pressed it into Astrid's hands. "What's this?" Astrid asked, puzzled. Cameron smiled. "Something that belonged to your mother. She gave it to me when she left Charleston. I think it's time it found its way back to you." Astrid sat down heavily in one of the wicker chairs, unwrapping the package carefully. Inside was a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. She turned it over in her hand, heart squeezing painfully. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, were the words, "Strength is not given, it's chosen." Astrid opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a faded photo of her mother as a young woman, her smile wide and hopeful. "I want you to remember," Cameron said, voice low, "that no matter what they say, no matter how hard they push, you are enough." Astrid closed the locket carefully, pressing it to her chest. "I'll never be what they expect," she whispered. Cameron's eyes softened. "Good. They don't need another Caldwell puppet. They need someone who remembers what matters." Mason moved closer, kneeling beside Astrid's chair. He took the locket gently from her hands, examining it like something precious. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. Astrid reached out and touched his cheek lightly, the roughness of his stubble grounding her. "I know," she said, her voice breaking around the edges. Cameron rose, smoothing her skirt. "I should be going. I needed to see you both. Needed to remind you." Astrid hugged her again, holding on longer than she meant to. As Cameron left, Mason and Astrid stood together in the doorway, watching the taillights of her car disappear down the long drive. The night was cool and crisp, the stars cutting sharp against the dark sky. Mason turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I want to show you something," he said suddenly. Astrid frowned. "What?" "Come on," he said, grabbing her hand and tugging her down the stone path leading into the gardens. They wove through hedges and under low-hanging branches until they reached a secluded corner Astrid had never seen before. A small stone bench sat beneath a massive willow tree, its branches trailing down like a curtain. "This was my mother's favorite spot," Mason said, his voice barely a whisper. "When things got bad, when the house got too loud or too cruel, she came here." Astrid sat down slowly, running her fingers over the worn stone. "I think she would have liked you," Mason said, sitting beside her. Astrid leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I would have liked her," she whispered. They sat there in silence, the willow tree sheltering them from the rest of the world. The locket lay heavy and warm against Astrid's heart, a reminder of where she came from and of where she was going. Mason laced their fingers together, squeezing gently. For the first time, Astrid didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something terrifying. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of something extraordinary. And she wasn't standing alone. The days that followed blurred into a cautious kind of peace. But Astrid knew better than to trust it. Tension hummed beneath the surface of the Caldwell mansion, sharp as a blade. Mason was different now, more present, more deliberate. He sought her out during the day, brushed his hand against hers when no one was looking, leaned in just a little too close when they spoke. Small things, but they built something solid, something real. Astrid could feel it weaving between them, stronger with every passing moment. But so could everyone else. The warning came one humid afternoon when Astrid returned from visiting Grandma Cameron at the hospital. A single cream-colored envelope sat waiting for her on her dressing table, her name scrawled across it in a hand she didn't recognize. Frowning, she tore it open. Inside, a photograph. Astrid's breath caught. It was her, caught on camera weeks ago, outside the diner where she used to work, handing an envelope to the diner's manager. A simple goodbye, a final paycheck. But without context, it looked like a payoff, a shady transaction. Pinned to the photo was a simple, chilling note. Everyone has a price. Astrid sank onto the edge of the bed, the walls pressing in around her. She could hear the house breathing around her, ancient and heavy. Panic clawed at her throat. She barely registered the soft knock before Mason pushed the door open. "Astrid?" One look at her face, and he was across the room in 3 strides. "What is it?" he demanded, kneeling in front of her, searching her eyes. Wordlessly, she handed him the photo and note. Mason's jaw clenched as he took them in. His hands shook slightly, whether from anger or fear. She didn't know. "Who gave this to you?" he asked, voice low. Astrid shook her head. "I don't know. It was just here." Mason stood abruptly, pacing the room, the photograph crumpling slightly in his fist. "They're trying to set you up," he said tightly. "Trying to make it look like you—" "I know," Astrid whispered. Mason turned to face her, his expression torn between fury and heartbreak. "You don't deserve this." Astrid stood too, crossing the room to him. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the furious thump of his heart under her palms. "It doesn't matter what they think," she said softly. "It only matters what we know." Mason stared down at her, the tension in his body slowly easing. "They're never going to stop, are they?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Mason shook his head. "No. Not until we prove to them that we don't break." Astrid looked up at him, really looked, and saw the same stubborn hope burning in his eyes that she felt in her own chest. "Then we don't break," she said. Mason exhaled, a shaky breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You're incredible. You know that?" Astrid smiled, a tremulous thing. "Takes one to know one." Mason cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing along her jawline. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but he just rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in like she was the only thing tethering him to the ground. "I'm going to find out who did this," he said fiercely. "And when I do—" "You don't have to fight every battle alone," Astrid interrupted gently. Mason pulled back just enough to meet her gaze, his own softening. "Neither do you," he murmured. The weight of the past weeks pressed down on them, every whisper, every cold glance, every attempt to drive a wedge between them, and for once Astrid didn't feel small under it. She felt stronger, stronger because Mason was standing beside her, stronger because she had finally chosen herself. And as the last of the sunlight faded from the windows, Astrid made herself a promise. Whatever came next, whatever storm they had yet to weather, they would face it together, unbreakable, unafraid, ready. The morning after the photograph surfaced, the Caldwell estate was unusually quiet. Too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Astrid stood in the kitchen, absently stirring a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The silver locket Grandma Cameron had given her hung heavy around her neck, its presence a constant reminder of who she was, and who she refused to become. Mason entered, shrugging into a jacket, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked rested, but Astrid could see the tension in his shoulders, the restless energy in his movements. "I have a meeting with Jacob," he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. I think I know where the photo came from. Astrid set the spoon down carefully. Do you want me to come? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not this time. I need him to see I'm serious. She nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Mason crossed the room, resting his hands lightly on her waist. His touch was grounding, steady. Whatever happens, he said, leaning down until their foreheads touched. We're still us. Astrid closed her eyes, breathing him in. Coffee and soap and something uniquely him. Go, she whispered. Show him who you are. Mason kissed her forehead, a brief, fierce press of lips, then pulled away and disappeared down the hall. Astrid stood there long after the sound of his footsteps faded, her heart a tight knot in her chest. The hours dragged. Astrid tried to distract herself, reading, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing, wandering the gardens, but nothing worked. Her mind kept circling back to Mason, to Jacob, to the invisible war playing out behind closed doors. Finally, she ended up back in the sunroom, staring out at the overgrown roses swaying in the breeze. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Caroline stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Astrid stiffened, instinctively bracing herself. You're making things very difficult for everyone, Caroline said, her voice smooth as silk. Astrid folded her arms across her chest. Good. Caroline tilted her head, studying her like a specimen under glass. You really think he can protect you? That he can save you from what's coming? Astrid met her gaze without flinching. I don't need saving. Caroline's smile didn't reach her eyes. Neither did Mason. Until you made him weak. The words sliced deep, but Astrid refused to let it show. You're wrong, she said calmly. Mason's not weak. He's stronger than any of you because he knows what matters. Caroline's mouth twisted, just slightly before she smoothed it away. Enjoy your moment, Astrid, she said as she turned to leave. It won't last. Astrid watched her go, the air in the room thick with the scent of fading flowers and dying threats. She didn't know what Jacob or Caroline had planned next. But for the first time, the fear didn't paralyze her. Because love wasn't a weakness. It was their greatest weapon. And she was ready to fight for it. Astrid paced the length of the sunroom, the floor cool under her bare feet. Afternoon light spilled across the tiles, but it felt muted, distant. The conversation with Caroline still echoed in her mind, sharp and poisonous. Yet, underneath it all, there was something stronger growing inside her. A resolve she hadn't known she possessed. The door creaked open, and Mason stepped inside, his face unreadable, his movements deliberate. Astrid froze, searching his expression for some sign. Hope, anger, defeat. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, then stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. It's done, he said quietly. Astrid blinked. What do you mean? Mason's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened. I confronted him. Jacob. About everything. Caroline, the setup, the threats. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. And Mason exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair. He tried to deny it at first, said it was for the good of the company, for my protection. His mouth twisted bitterly, but he didn't expect me to walk away. Astrid's breath caught. You walked away? Mason nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. I told him I'm done, that I won't be controlled anymore. Not by him, not by anyone. Astrid stared at him, her chest tightening with a fierce, aching pride. "Mason," she whispered. He stepped closer, cradling her face in his hands. "I chose you, Astrid. Not because it's easy. Not because it makes sense, but because it's right." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the hard lines of his face into something unbearably tender. "I don't have a plan yet," Mason admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't know what happens next." Astrid pressed her hands to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart under her palms. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice trembling. "Together." A slow smile broke across his face, and he kissed her, soft, reverent, like a promise sealed between them. When they finally pulled apart, Mason tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Something we should talk about." Astrid tilted her head, sensing the shift in his energy. "What is it?" Mason hesitated, searching her eyes. "I want to make this real, not just surviving together. Living, building something better." Astrid's breath hitched. "You mean?" Mason pulled something from his pocket. A simple gold ring, no diamonds, no frills. "Just a band, plain and shining. I want to marry you for real," he said. "No contracts. No bargains. Just us." Astrid's heart shattered and reformed in the same breath, 1,000 pieces stitching themselves back together stronger than before. She took the ring from his hand, turning it over between her fingers, the metal warm from his skin. "I would have said yes even without the ring," she whispered, tears sliding freely down her cheeks now. Mason smiled, crooked and boyish, and slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled just slightly. "Good," he said. "Because I wasn't leaving without an answer." Astrid laughed, a wet, broken sound full of joy. She threw her arms around his neck, and he caught her easily, spinning her once, before settling her against his chest. For the first time, Astrid realized that this was what safety felt like. Not walls, not money, not names written in blood and contracts. Just love. Messy, fierce, unbreakable love. And she wasn't afraid anymore. The next morning broke soft and golden over the Caldwell estate, sunlight slipping through the heavy drapes like quiet promises. Astrid lay still for a long time, listening to Mason's even breathing beside her, the steady rhythm of it grounding her in this new reality. They were building piece by fragile piece. When she finally slid out of bed, careful not to wake him, the locket around her neck bumped lightly against her skin. She pressed it between her fingers, closing her eyes for a moment. Strength is not given. It's chosen. Today, she would choose it again. Downstairs, the house hummed with a strange, uneasy energy. Whispers in the halls. Quick glances from the staff. Word of Mason's decision to sever ties with Jacob Caldwell had spread faster than wildfire, and the walls themselves seemed to shift under the weight of it. Astrid made her way to the garden, needing air, needing space to clear her racing mind. The willow tree that Mason had shown her swayed gently in the morning breeze, its long tendrils brushing the stone bench like a secret handshake. She sat there, tracing the edge of the locket absently, trying to imagine what life would look like now. No guarantees. No gilded promises. Just them, carving out something real from the wreckage. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. Mason. He didn't speak right away, just sank down beside her, elbows resting on his knees, staring out across the misty lawn. "You scared?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. Astrid thought about it, about the uncertainty, the cold glares they'd keep enduring. The endless battle to prove they deserved the life they were fighting for. Terrified, she admitted, a shaky laugh escaping her. But not of being with you. Mason turned his head, studying her like he was memorizing her. Same, he said, voice rough. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. I talked to Grandma Cameron this morning, Astrid said. Told her everything. Mason smiled a little. Was she mad? She said. Astrid swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden rush of emotion. She said, the strongest homes are built from storms, not sunshine. Mason's thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow and steady. She's right, he murmured. We're building something stronger. Astrid leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her cheek. After a while, Mason shifted, pulling a small envelope from his jacket. What's that? She asked. He held it out to her. Open it. Astrid took it, heart-pounding, and slid her finger under the flap. Inside was a piece of thick, expensive paper, a deed, to a modest piece of land just outside Charleston, a place untouched by the Caldwell legacy. Untouched by everything that had tried to tear them apart. Astrid, Mason said, voice low and trembling, I want us to build a real home. Our home from the ground up. She stared at the paper, then up at him, her throat too tight to speak. Mason cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't even realized were falling. It won't be a mansion, he said, smiling a little. Might not even have a proper driveway for a while, but it'll be ours. Astrid laughed through her tears, pure and bright. I don't care about the driveway, she whispered. I just want you. Mason kissed her then, slow and deep, sealing promises that didn't need words. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was higher in the sky, burning away the last of the morning mist. A new day was waiting. And this time, they were ready for it. Together. The late afternoon sun melted into gold over the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. Astrid stood barefoot in the middle of the field, the warm earth crumbling under her toes, the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers wrapping around her like a second skin. The land Mason had given her, their land, was still raw, still rough. No white picket fences yet, no grand house. Just foundation stakes driven into the ground, outlines barely carved. But it was more beautiful than any mansion she'd ever walked through. Behind her, Mason approached, a small bundle cradled carefully in his arms. You ready? He called out, his voice easy, laced with something brighter than hope, certainty. Astrid turned, her heart catching as she saw the tiny, squirming bundle wrapped tightly in a soft blue blanket. Their daughter, perfect, fierce, a piece of both of them, born into a world they'd fought tooth and nail to carve out. She crossed the distance between them, her hands trembling slightly as she took the baby into her arms. The infant's tiny fist curled around the edge of Astrid's shirt, the grip impossibly strong for something so new, so fragile. She's stubborn, Mason said, laughing quietly. Wonder where she gets that from. Astrid shot him a look, but the smile tugging at her mouth gave her away. She's a Caldwell, Mason added, stepping close enough that his arm brushed against hers. And a Bennett. Astrid rested her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, breathing him in, the baby's soft gurgle between them anchoring her more firmly to this new, messy, precious life. A breeze swept across the field, rustling the tall grass. Astrid adjusted the blanket around the baby, her hand brushing against something stitched into the fabric, a corner of the blue silk scarf Grandma Cameron had given her, now sewn carefully into the lining. Strength is not given. It's chosen. Mason's fingers found hers, twining them together with a confidence that still made her chest ache. "We're doing it," he said quietly, looking out across the empty field that would one day hold their home. Astrid followed his gaze, imagining it. The front porch wrapped around the house, a garden bursting wild and colorful, laughter echoing across the yard. A life built from nothing but love and grit and stubborn belief. "We are," she whispered back. Behind them, the world they had left behind, the power plays, the sharp whispers, the expectations, felt 1,000 miles away. Maybe those battles would come again someday. Maybe there would always be people waiting for them to stumble. But Astrid knew now that survival wasn't about armor. It wasn't about building walls so high nothing could reach her. It was about choosing to stand anyway. About choosing each other again and again, no matter how many times the world tried to tear them apart. "Hey," Mason said, nudging her gently. "You thinking about running?" Astrid laughed, the sound light and free. "Not a chance," she said, adjusting the baby in her arms, feeling the tiny heartbeat fluttering against her chest. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Mason smiled, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I still owe you a real wedding," he said. Astrid raised an eyebrow. "You mean the first one wasn't real?" He chuckled. "It was survival. This one's for joy." She rested her head against his chest, the steady thump of his heart, a song she never wanted to stop hearing. "Then let's make it simple," she murmured. "Just us. Here, with her." Mason kissed the top of her head. "Perfect." They stood there for a long time, watching the sky burn down into twilight, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. Eventually, Mason pulled back, tilting her chin up so she was forced to look into his eyes. "I love you," he said simply. No grand speeches, no hesitation. Astrid smiled, the kind of smile that cracked something open inside her, let the light pour in. "I love you too," she said. And in that moment, surrounded by nothing but an empty field, a baby wrapped in a piece of memory, and a boy who had once been reckless enough to think he didn't need anyone, Astrid realized something important. Love wasn't perfect. It was messy and hard and terrifying, but it was also the strongest thing she had ever known. It was the thing that saved her. The thing that built her. And it was the thing that would carry them forward, hand in hand, heart against heart, into whatever came next. Because real love wasn't about fairy tales or easy endings. It was about choosing each other, over and over again. Every messy, beautiful, stubborn day. And Astrid Bennett Caldwell had never been more ready to choose. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way.